Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. Hey everyone, before today's episode gets started, I just want to talk a little bit about the fight against Alzheimer's. For those of you that don't know, my family has been impacted by Alzheimer's, and my wife and I are members of the Young Champions for the Minnesota North Dakota chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. The world may look a little different right now, but one thing hasn't changed: the Alzheimer's Association's commitment to ending Alzheimer's. This year, Walk to End Alzheimer's is everywhere on every sidewalk, track, and trail. Due to COVID, this year won't be a large in-person gathering. Instead, everyone will be walking in small teams of friends and family. We are all still walking and fundraising for the same thing: a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. So I'm asking that if you can, please support our team for the Alzheimer's Association's Walk to End Alzheimer's. This walk is the world's largest event to raise awareness and funds for Alzheimer's care, support, and research. Thank you in advance, and you can find information and links below. And now, back to the show. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about a topic it might seem like it's a little bit off the wall. It kind of came about, actually, if you saw my episode where I did the Commander 2060 spoilers. I mean, that episode from the future, definitely from the future, with the Commander 2060 spoilers that are totally real and whatnot. If you saw that episode, you heard me mention mono purple being a color and how it is just slightly worse than mono white. And basically, kind of that got me thinking. Mono white is by far many considered to be the weakest color in Commander. But, I mean, if you consider colorless to be a color, that's kind of a weird statement. Basically, my question is colorless actually more powerful than mono white? Is it better than mono white? And this might seem like a really weird question because, I mean, mono white has access to a ton more cards than colorless does. In fact, mono white has access to pretty much, I believe, every single colorless card, and colorless only has access to just colorless cards, and mono white has access to colorless plus all the mono white cards. So you'd think that with a card pool that's larger, mono white would clearly have an advantage over colorless. But I think we should dig down into this, and actually there's a card that came up recently that kind of made me think about this even further, about kind of where colorless stacks up compared to the other colors, which it's, in my opinion, less than all the colors except for potentially mono white, and that's where the debate is today. And of course, mono purple, if you've seen the Commander 2060 episode. But anyways, the card that kind of sparked this again for me and made me want to really do an episode about it is the one that was recently spoiled, somewhat recently spoiled, in Zendikar Rising with Forsaken Monument. Forsaken Monument is a legendary artifact that costs 5, and it says colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever you tap a permanent for colorless, add an additional colorless, and whenever you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. So this is just a absolute bomb in any colorless deck. Essentially, I mean, again, I don't like to say auto-include. I don't really know if I really necessarily believe that auto-include is actually a thing, but this is probably the closest thing that you can get to an auto-include in a deck, because again, in a colorless deck, this is just a shoo-in. You know, every single one of your lands are going to tap for double. Every single one of your colorless creatures get +2/+2, and you're going to be gaining a ton of life because you're going to be casting a lot of colorless spells in that kind of a deck. I mean, this, basically, if it was for any other color, would probably have one of the 3 things, or maybe 2 at the very most, but definitely not all 3 of those things. So this is an absolute, again, a bomb in a colorless deck, and something that's not going to benefit a mono-white deck pretty much at all. So this is definitely kind of a step up from a Gauntlet of Power. It's kind of like a Gauntlet of Power, but for colorless, and it, again, does have kind of extra things. Gauntlet of Power is a pretty expensive card. Try not to talk about too many expensive cards in this channel, but basically, when it comes into play, you choose a color. Creatures of the chosen color get +1/+1. Whenever a basic land is tapped for mana of the chosen color, its controller adds 1 mana of that color to the mana pool. So, this does, let's say in a mono white deck, yes, it gives your creatures +1/+1, which is worse than +2/+2 from the Forsaken Monument. It also doubles up all of your basic lands, so any of your utility lands in mono white aren't going to help you out. Your planes will, and they'll double up, so there is somewhat of a comparison there, but pretty much, again, Forsaken Monument is going to be better in any which way when it comes to mono white with Gauntlet Power versus Forsaken Monument with colorless. Now, that's not the only reason that kind of this debate came up, again, for me, where I'm thinking, okay, colorless, yes, is at a big disadvantage because it has access to literally no cards that have any color. So yeah, mono white has an advantage when it comes to the number of cards they can pick from. But mono white does have a lot of weaknesses that are somewhat kind of dealt with in colorless in a weird-ish way, and I'll talk about that now. So, Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, Zhalfirin Void, and Bonder's Enclave are kind of They're really simple lands, but they're utility lands for other colors. But in Colorless, you can pretty much use all the utility lands that you want because, again, you don't need to really mana fix in Colorless. You just use these utility lands that just have for Colorless, and those are your lands. So you basically get kind of free utility lands you can utilize. If you've got 36 lands in your deck, every single one of them can be a non-basic. So in that case, you'd be using a waste. But in these, yeah, you're just using these utility lands that basically are just regular lands that have additional abilities that can help you out throughout the game. Shrine of the Forsaken Gods taps for Colorless, or can tap to add Colorless, but you can only spend this mana to cast color spells. Activates the ability only if you control 7 or more lands. So this is basically land ramp on a land that has like no downside to it because, it's just basically a waste at its base level. And then on top of that, if you get to 7 lands, then it's going to be tapping for 2, and you only get to spend it to cast color spells, but you're going to be doing that anyways. Zhalfir and Void, when it enters the battlefield, you scry 1, and it taps to add colors. So this is basically like a temple, one of those temple scry lands for, those are dual lands, I guess, but it comes into play untap unlike those. So this is just a free scry just because you played a land. Ponder's Enclave taps for colorless, and you can pay 3 and tap it to draw a card. Activates ability only if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. That's a pretty low bar to get to. And having a land that can help you draw cards, there are plenty of utility lands out there that can be very helpful in a colorless deck. That you can use in a mono white deck, but you're limited to using a certain number of those essentially because you do need some planes still to fix your mana to make sure you can still cast your white spells. Whereas colorless decks, again, all 36 of your lands or however many you have in your deck can be utility lands, and they can really help you out throughout the game and can do some really unique things. So that kind of shores up some of the weaknesses that colorless has when it comes to a lack of access to the multitude of cards that mono white does. Another thing, and this is just a 2-card example, is that there are certain cards that benefit you, like that Forsaken Monument for being in colorless, like All Is Dust. All Is Dust says each player sacrifices all colored permanents they control. So this is going to affect you not at all, and this is going to very much affect every single one of your opponents, making them pretty much lose everything but their artifacts, and yeah, goodbye to all your things. Ugin the Spirit Dragon is another example of this. Basically, if you saw the Extra Turns episode on the command zone that I was in, this definitely hosed me quite a bit. The minus X is exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less, that's 1 or more colors. So yeah, almost all my things got erased from existence in that episode and set me back a lot. That wouldn't have happened if I was playing a colorless deck because that wouldn't affect me at all. It would just be like, hey, I'm keeping all my things on the board and everyone else loses their thing. So again, you can utilize these in a colorless deck. All Is Dust, I believe, is around $5. I could be very wrong on that. Ugin, much more expensive. But again, if you've got the budget for it and you want to add that in your colorless deck, it can definitely be a one-sided board wipe. Both these are fantastic cards. Speaking of colorless decks, let's talk about some commanders that can be pretty powerful when built around in not in the right way, but in a powerful way for a colorless commander. Kozilek the Great Distortion, Emrakul the Promised End, Ulamong the Infinite Gyre. Some really heavy hitters. They're all Eldrazi, of course. Kozilek the Great Distortion, I've done a deck tech on. A 12/12 for 8 colorless. When you cast Kozilek the Great Distortion, if you have fewer than 7 cards in hand, draw cards equal to the difference. Menace, discard a card with converted mana cost X, counter target spell with converted mana cost X. This is a heavy hitter that can protect itself and you by allowing you to discard cards to counter spells. And also, it refills your hand when you cast it. So maybe you've got some ways to also bring it back to your hand and recast it so you can draw back some more too. And hitting for 12 each turn with Menace is pretty brutal. Emrakul the Promised End, a 13/13 that costs 13, but it's going to cost 1 less to cast for each card type among cards in your graveyard. Whenever you cast Emrakul, you gain control of target opponent during that player's next turn. After that turn, that player takes an extra turn. Flying, trample, protection from instants. So, yeah, a 13/13 flying trample with protection from instants is huge. And also, being able to cast it for cheaper and gaining control of an opponent's turn is an incredibly powerful thing. Even if they get an extra turn after that, you can still really throw a wrench into all their plans. You can see exactly what they're doing, and you can utilize their board to take down another one of your opponents. Ulamog the Infinite Gyre, a 10/10 indestructible that costs 11. Whenever you cast a spell, destroy target permanent, it's got Annihilator 4. So yeah, Annihilator is an absolutely brutal mechanic, especially on something that's indestructible. So once you get this out, you blow up something, and then you also can just start swinging with it and making someone sacrifice a ton of things. So these are all 3 very powerful commanders. Yeah, they just are. And when you compare kind of these commanders to maybe the top mono white commanders, I think it's kind of hard pressed to say that mono white has an advantage. And I'm not exactly pulling, the exact top ones when it comes to number of decks. I'm kind of trying to get a different kind of view on commanders that do different things and that are decently popular in the colors. So Shram Senior Edificer is a 2/2 Dwarf Advisor. Whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. This is actually one of my first deck techs on the channel. I really like Shram, actually, and I did an aura deck around it. But this is kind of like some of the other ones, this is a Voltron-style commander. But you can definitely do it in a couple different ways, but still, there is a somewhat of a weakness to Shram where you are very much dependent on having your board full of either auras or equipment, or if you go with vehicles. So it can be a powerful commander, but it can also be a very all-in commander that doesn't really have maybe that protection that a Kozilek has where you can counter things, or Ulamong being indestructible, or Emrakul having protection from instants. So God Eternal Oquetra is another one. A 3/6 with double strike. Whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 4/4 black zombie warrior creature token with vigilance. When it dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, you may put it on top of its owner's library, throw it from the top. So that is somewhat of a protection to it. It is kind of a risky maneuver to put your commander into your library in case it gets shuffled or whatnot. But basically, being able to create an army full of zombie warriors can be really good, especially if you've got creatures that you can, cast and bring back to your hand and cast again and so on and so forth. Definitely a more powerful when it comes to a mono white commander, but still, if you kind of level it against kind of other commanders out there, not too powerful. Teshar, Ancestors Apostles, probably, in my opinion, the most powerful out of all the mono white commanders because it can be pretty easily broken. It says whenever you cast a Zoric spell, return target creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So basically, you're going to be building an artifact kind of storm deck, an eggs deck, where you're just kind of casting spell after spell after spell, getting back certain creatures that have either ETBs or LTBs or whatnot, getting you back those artifacts again, and just being able to do is kind of storm off from there. So again, when it comes to mono white, your options for powerful commanders are somewhat limited. And I brought this up on this channel before, but the biggest weaknesses for mono white are card draw and then also ramp. And actually, in the recent years, we have had, in some recent sets, we have had some improvements to mono white with certain cards like Smothering Tithe. It says whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If that player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color. So essentially, when your opponents are drawing cards, you're going to be gaining temporary mana advantage through treasures. Mangar the Diplomat says whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you and or planeswalkers you control, draw a card. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, draw a card. So those are 2 different ways to potentially draw cards throughout the game with a card like this. And then Keeper of the Accord is a 3/4 human soldier that says at the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more creatures than you, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. At the beginning of each opponent's end step, if that player controls more lands than you may search your library for a basic plains card, put it onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle your library. So these are basically if you're behind, you get creatures. If you're behind in lands, you get plains. And yeah, that you're going to be probably behind if you're in mono white when it comes to lands most of the time. But basically, something to consider with these, though, is that Mangar and Keeper of the Accord, while they are both pretty effective at drawing cards, or can be very effective at drawing cards and, ramping you or getting creatures out, they are creatures, so they are more vulnerable than other things that would be doing the same thing in other colors. So there are improvements that have happened in white, and again, I think that when it comes to comparing mono white to colorless, colorless does have a slight advantage because, again, you can just utilize all the utility lands to do things for you. Again, there are utility lands that draw you cards. There are going to be ones that can make tokens. There are going to be ones that can even ramp you. But again, a mono white deck is somewhat limited on the number of those utility lands that it can really utilize effectively without kind of not being able to get enough planes to cast certain spells. So there is kind of that balance to it. Again, at the end of the day, I would have to probably say that mono white has got to be, better than colorless, but the fact that it's actually a topic, or is the fact that it can actually be kind of questioned, is really interesting. Again, I do like that Wizards is starting to go in the direction of giving mono white certain ways to ramp, certain ways to draw cards. Again, I think that's just something that, in other formats maybe isn't needed. You don't really need mono white in standard to be drawing cards and to be ramping. But in Commander, every single color really needs kind of certain ways to do that because mono white really is just a huge disadvantage. You don't want a player kind of being at a giant disadvantage just for wanting to play a certain color. When they come into a game, playing a mono white deck, you're probably going to lose just because, that person's got, a mono green deck or a Timber deck or whatnot. You don't want a giant advantage just from starting off because you don't have access to kind of the basic necessities of the game. But yeah, that's my basic take on it. So yeah, in the comments below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So am I completely out of it? Is colorless better than mono white? Is mono white better than colorless? Is it even close? Am I completely wrong on this? And yeah, just let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. So as always, thanks again and have a good one.